Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Fistful of Datas, which is episode 8 of season 6 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. So I have to start with, we don't need to start with the spoiler warning. This is more than 30 years old. You really need to have seen it. If you haven't seen it by now and you're watching a review on it, that's kind of on you. But anyway, so A Fistful of Datas is the episode in which Worf and his son Alexander and Counselor Troy go into the holodeck to do a Old West program, or as they call it, Ancient West. And something goes wrong with an experiment that Data is running on himself, and it messes up the holodeck program where they can't exit and the safeties are gone off, and then all the bad guys in the program turn to Data and they have the speed of a android, and so Worf has to figure a way out. So he comes up with like this force field thingy, manages to save his life and Alexander's life, and the program ends and everything's fine. So this I trying to remember, but I'm pretty sure I had this in my top 10 most overrated of the franchise, and if I didn't, I think I did, but if I didn't, it should be there, but I'm pretty sure I did, because I think this episode's highly overrated. Now, in the past, I had put this in my top 10 worst, or even top 5 worst, I believe, of TNG. Well, I did top 5 like many years ago, and more recently it was top 10. And the more I think about it, the more I think I wouldn't quite do that. Like, I don't think it's definitely not going to make my top 10 worst this time. Might not even make my top 20 worst, to be honest. But I think the reason why I had it in that worst category was because of the fact it was so overrated. Well, I don't know. The first time I put it in my top 5, I didn't realize how well liked this episode was. I was actually surprised by all the pushback I got saying, "Oh, this is a great episode. It was a ton of fun." People always say that about bad episodes. Whenever there's a terrible episode, they always say, "Oh, it was a lot of fun." And I just talked about this last week, that just because there's no such, I mean, there is such a thing as a fun episode, and there are episodes I think are fun that other people don't like Move Along Home is a classic example, but usually it flips the other way for me. Usually everyone else will be saying it's a fun episode, and I'm like, no, it's not fun, it's crap. And this is what this episode falls in. Now, I think the reason why I used to put this in my worst list is because I don't like Westerns, and I was actively irritated by this episode whenever I went through the rotation, or it just so happened to be on syndication or whatever. I would always get really frustrated when I had to watch this episode. No one's forced me, I could always skip it, but still, it was, it's not an episode I enjoy watching. Now, I don't like Westerns. That is a bias. Now, that's not to say I don't like any Westerns. I just don't like Westerns in general. Like, there's some Westerns I do like. Struggling to think of one. I know Unforgiven, I can say off the top of my head, I like, but that. And also there's a movie from the 70s, because when I went to college, I took a course about classic films, and one of the modules we were doing in that course was specifically about Westerns. So I went back, even though I knew I didn't like Westerns, I went back and I watched all these Westerns from like the 50s and 60s and 70s, even though I don't like them, but I've never seen them before, so I went back and watched them. And most of them I thought were just okay. There was none I absolutely hated. It's funny because there's some like classic ones, like The Treasure of Sierra, whatever that's called, the one with Humphrey Bogart. Movies like that, I noticed the plot immediately, because all these cartoons I used to watch as a kid, like DuckTales and Tiny Toons and all those sorts of things, would do verbatim these classic movies, and redress them. Well, Tiny Toons would do it as a parody, but something like DuckTales and whatnot would just present it as if it was an original piece, but they're really just verbatim copying this classic film, and so I was surprised to find that. But anyway, so most of them I thought were just okay. Like High Noon, that's something I'd seen a billion times, done over and over again throughout modern media. Like 3 O'Clock High, I remember that came out. But High Noon I thought was kind of boring. The Dollar Trilogy, or whatever they call it, the Clint Eastwood, Good, the Bad, the Ugly, and stuff like that, everyone goes crazy about and act like it's like a masterpiece. It was okay. I feel like people just like it because of the amazing cinematography, and that's not really, or the style of it, and that's not really my jam. Like, I did appreciate the style, but it's not enough to make me call it a masterpiece. But there was a movie that a Western I really liked, that I never even heard of before, called Little Big Man, that came out, I believe, in the early 70s with Dustin Hoffman. And I realized while watching it that the movie Forrest Gump pretty much just ripped that movie off. It was because it was like the Western version of Forrest Gump, because the main character was, someone who was not very bright, not very smart, and just so happened to meet all these big historical figures. In this case, it was in the Old West figures like, Wild Bill and random people, and just, happened to be involved in like some historic events and would just go from place to place. So it was like the Western Forrest Gump. But I actually really liked that movie. And a big theme of it, though, was that it was presenting most Westerns, and there were a few that I saw that were really bad about this, negatively stereotyped Native Americans, where this Western sort of portrayed them as savages, and the villain said the boogeyman that's going to get you, where this film did the opposite. It showed it really, in some ways probably exaggerated, but really emphasized the genocide that was committed on the Native American people. And I liked it because of that. I think that made it great. So the whole point of what I'm saying is, this is real big aside, but the whole point is the Westerns I tend to like Unforgiven and Little Big Man, they subvert the tropes of typical Westerns. Like I watched a couple John Wayne movies too, like The Searchers, and I thought that was so boring. But anyway, and I'm trying to think, I'm sure there's other Westerns out there I do like. Westworld, but I prefer the seasons when it's not a Western. But, and as a sci-fi Western, so that's different. But, Little Big Man, Unforgiven. Like, Unforgiven purposely subverted the tropes of Westerns, because it wasn't like the good guys versus the bad guys or the good sheriff. It was like, and it wasn't like, the shoot 'em up. It was kind of showing a more dark and gritty, more realistic portrayal of what the Old West was probably like. And Little Big Man, as I said, was subverting all the Western tropes because the main character was like a bumbling idiot who was not very good at shooter, and it portrayed all of the the American armed forces as the bad guys, as perpetrators of genocide, which historically a lot of them were. But that's not how typical Westerns go, though. So that tends to be so this is a long ass way of just me saying that, I don't like Western tropes. When I say I don't like a genre, it tends to be like I would say the same thing about horror as well as Westerns, and maybe even the mob movies and stuff, is that I don't like the trope, and even like heist movies or stuff like that. If it's too tropey and it's just following the tropes, this applies across the board basically to any genre, even sci-fi. If it's just handsome captain on a spaceship going around saving the day. It's too tropey. Like any genre that is too tropey, and it just follows the typical tropes beat for beat for beat, I'm gonna hate it. Yeah, that definitely applies to heist movies and maybe many other genres too I'm not thinking of. And so in general, when I pick out specific genres like horror or Western, the reason why I'm doing that is because the vast majority of that movies belonging to that genre follow the tropes, especially horror. They just follow the tropes. That's why the horror movies I do like don't do that, and they do something original. And yeah, you can apply it to action movies as well if it's just following this typical tropes. But yeah, I think Westerns and horror are the two worst genres in that regard, that just follow the tropes and they're cliche and don't really add anything original. And if there's movies out there that do add stuff to the original, I tend to like them. But in general, there's not that many of them, so then I say I don't like the genre. And so the whole point of this episode is to pay homage to the Westerns. So if you're going to want to pay homage to the Western genre, and the Western genre is typically, the whole thing is about following the tropes, obviously that homage is just going to follow the tropes. And so I don't find that interesting. I just don't. Now, maybe that's my bias. And I think, honestly, if I look at this episode on its own merits, which I will get a lot more into in a second, but if I look at it in its own merits, forgetting about the Western genre, it's a very forgettable episode. And so, because I think the people who like this episode, this is just my guess, I don't want to put words in other people's mouths, but this is what I've gathered from what I've seen. The people who like this episode like it because they like Westerns. And so even though the episode itself, minus the genre, is just following the Star Trek Trapped in the Holodeck trope, speaking of following the tropes. But they're willing to be like, oh, but it's a Western, so it's fun. Because it reminds me of these Westerns I saw as a kid, and it has this nostalgia value, and it's fun seeing the TNG characters in a Western. And so they go from this episode's average to this episode's pretty damn good, because it's a fun Western style. So my point is, if I don't have that perspective of, oh, I had a lot of nostalgia for Westerns and I love seeing a Western, I don't, because I don't like Westerns, then I don't have that boost that everyone else who loves this episode has. I just ignore the Western thing. In fact, the Western thing kind of knocks it down instead of knocking it up, but I try not to hold that against the episode and judge it on its own merits and just forget about the genre. Then I'm at that middle stage of this is just a tropey holodeck, trapped in a holodeck episode. And that's what it is. Now, to be fair, getting into the specifics of the episode, I think that this could have been a good episode, regardless of being a Western. Because as I said, like, if you have a good story, but it's set in a Western, I'm still going to like it, like Unforgiven or Little Big Man or the other things I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. I know there's more Westerns I like. So I thought that Wyatt Earp movie was actually decent. I just thought it was way better than Tombstone. I thought Tombstone was a giant piece of shit because it followed the tropes, whereas Wyatt Earp was a interesting twist on the biopic and portrayed Wyatt Earp as more of a despicable figure. It was more like realistic instead of the hero going and being a badass and saving the day. I just hate that. But anyway, that's beside the point. The point is, yeah, so if this was a good episode, I would have liked it regardless of whether or not it's a Western. And I think that it's not a good episode, and the only reason people do like it is because it's a Western. Where if I say I'm not going to hold it against the episode for being Western, but I'm not going to boost it for being a Western, then we break it down to the typical trapped in a holodeck trope, which I fucking hate. Now, as I said, so to be fair to this episode, judging it on my own merits, I was actually liking it in the first half, and I think that this could have been a really good episode. And it started out good because the story was Worf is a bad father because he has free time, and Alexander wants to go on the holodeck and spend time with his father, and he's trying to come up with any excuse not to do that. Which, yeah, that Worf is a bad father. But I understand why they do that, though. I think they don't intentionally intend to write Worf as a terrible father. I think there's other reasons why they do things, but the end result is that he's a bad father, and they don't necessarily intend for that to happen, but it's because of other plot contrivance. But anyway, so the reason why they do this, why they have Worf act like a bad father, is because they want him to go through a character journey, because he starts out the episode as like, oh, I don't want to do this, going on a holodeck, and by the end of the episode, he's like, oh, yes, I love this program, I'd love to spend more time with that, so they want that character journey, but by doing that, they're making Worf out as a bad father. But anyway, so he's a bad father, he doesn't want to go in the holodeck, and tries to come up with any excuse to, but Picard's like, no, go enjoy your free time. So Worf is like, oh, I guess I gotta go on a holodeck I gotta spend time with my son. So he goes in the holodeck, and he starts to get into it. He's like, because at first he was like, oh, he's not sure about this whole Western thing, but then he starts beating people up, and he's like, I see the appeal of this program, which I liked. Like, I thought I was really into the episode at that stage. I thought, wow. And then Counselor Troy shows up and shoots the guy's hat off, and she's like, I'm the stranger, which I think is it's good to give Counselor Troy something more to do and give her some more characteristics that her father used to read Westerns to her when she was younger, because her father's human, if you recall. And so I think that's and then she had this nostalgia for Westerns, and so she wanted to be involved. So I think that's a good character development for Troy. It's a good use of her. It's interesting use to have Troy, especially since she's kind of the mother figure to Alexander. It kind of makes sense that she would be there to spend time with them. And so to this point, I'm with it. I'm with this episode. Where it loses me, where the whole thing tanks, and I think you probably know where this is going, is when the trapped in holodeck cliche kicks in. And I talked a lot about this trapped in holodeck cliche in other videos, like when I reviewed The Big Goodbye and Elementary Dear Data and stuff like that. The Big Goodbye is a more direct example. I hate this trope a lot because it makes no sense why a piece of entertainment that's meant there to entertain people in their off time is a death trap that constantly tries to kill you, and the characters never treat it that way. And again, the writers don't intend to make it a death trap. It's just they're being lazy, and they were like, oh, we need a threat of the week, so let's have the holodeck mount. And it's a lazy go-to. Because the writer's perspective is, we want to do a fun, Western themed, or we want to do a fun Sherlock Holmes themes, or we want to do a fun gangster detective noir theme. So how can we do that? Oh, easy solution, holodeck, which is probably part of the reason why they invented the holodeck. And to be fair, sometimes they come up with more creative ways to do these kind of themed episodes without using the holodeck, but usually the holodeck's the easiest one. Oh, that's our go-to. We'll go to the holodeck. So we do a fun themed episode on the holodeck, but then they're like, oh, well, there needs to be a threat of the week. There needs to be some stakes. There needs to be dangers. People's lives need to be danger. So what's the easiest go-to? Holodeck malfunctions, and the safeties malfunction. They're trapped in the holodeck, and stuff is trying to kill them. And so it's a form of lazy writing. They're just, we want to have this fun themed episode. We want to make stakes. So this is the easiest, laziest way to do it. And they're not cognizant of the fact that they are making the holodeck a death trap when it's supposed to be an entertainment system, which is dumb, and it makes no sense, and it's just lazy on top of that. And honestly, in this case with this episode, and it's actually, to be fair, I said the same thing about Elementary Dear Data. It would have been better off without the stakes, without the threat of the week. If it was just Alexander and Worf in a Western program trying to do some bonding, and they made it a character story about Alexander and Worf, and maybe Counselor Troy involved as well, and they play out the program as normal. There's no malfunction, no safeties go off, no Data taking over the characters, so Brent Spiner can do all his ham acting. Just a normal Western holodeck, and I think it would have been a much, much better episode. I think it would have been a far superior episode. I actually would have enjoyed it despite the fact that it's a Western, because it would have been a good character story for Worf. It would have developed them more. And, even if you say, well, there's not enough meat in the bones of that story to withhold a whole entire episode, have a B plot. That's what B plots are for. In fact, you could even make this a B plot of a different episode. If there's not enough there to sustain a whole episode, then make this a B plot. But I think there would be enough to sustain the whole episode, to be fair. And the B plot, and I mentioned this in my review for Schisms, is that because in that episode they had a B plot of Data reading poetry, and that was completely, not only was it completely separate from the main storyline, it jarred with the tone of that episode, because the episode was a creepy episode about aliens abducting the crew members and cutting their arms off and reattaching and doing these horrific things. And this one guy died because his blood turned to liquid polymer or something. That's horrific. So having this side plot of Data being Felis Catus and writing a poem about Spot jarred with the theme, with the tone of the episode, I should say. And so my suggestion would be remove that B plot from that episode and just spend more time on the alien abduction, because I don't think they spent enough time on it to justify that storyline. So just don't even have a B plot in that episode. Just focus more on the alien abduction and put that B plot about Data and his poetry in this episode. Get rid of the bullshit with Data, doing the experiments and talking like a cowboy, and everyone, that poem comes up again in this episode where they're doing Crusher's play and Picard's music fucks up or whatever. You can still keep Picard's music, by the way, but just get rid of the side plot of Data doing these experiments with hooking himself up to the ship. Instead, do the B plot with Data's cat. It will have nothing to do with Worf in the Western. It doesn't need to. But it would be the same tone. That's why it would work. And so that's how you fix this episode. That's also how you fix Schisms. There, I fixed 2 episodes at the same time. And I think I would have liked both episodes much better if they did it that way. And so don't have a thread of the week. Just have a B plot with Data in this poetry, and there you go, voila, interesting character story. But no, I think, and a lot of it had to do with Rick Berman, that they have to have a threat every single. Well, there needs to be stakes. Actually, no. Like the episode Family, for example, that's the best example because Rick Berman said the same thing, that there needs to be stakes in this, so they wanted to do some stupid dumbass B plot about, which actually I think ended up being Remember Me. So it was about like crew members disappearing, but as they were writing it, they realized that that B plot really interfered with the A plot of the family theme. So instead, the B plot was also family theme. So it's the same theme, same tone, with Worf and his parents, and then it had a C plot as well with Wesley and learning about his father, and so it all worked in the same tone. And so there were no real stakes in that episode. They did kind of try to create fake stakes in that episode by having Picard like be faced with the choice of either staying on the Earth with his friend and going in the oceans or returning to the Enterprise, which was very fake stakes because obviously he's going to return to the Enterprise. But still, that's still not as bad as creating a threat of the week and putting everyone's lives in danger. That was one of the only times in TNG, I believe, that they did an episode without a threat of the week, without stakes. And that is a very much beloved episode. Now, I don't quite like it as much as everyone else, but I still like it. Like, I gave it an 8 out of 10. I think it was definitely better than this episode. That's for damn sure. Because and it was one of the rare times they were able to talk Rick Berman out of doing the threat of the week, and I wish they were able to talk him out of it more, because we would have had way more good episodes and less bad episodes like this one. I think this episode would have improved tenfold if you remove this, because that's when the episode loses me. As soon as we start to get into, the holodecks are malfunctioning, and this entertainment system is being a death trap again, and no one's taking it seriously. This one is particularly egregious, actually. It's worse than many of the other Trapped in the Holodeck episodes, because the people outside of the holodeck, like Geordi and Picard and Data and all of them, they never, through the course of this entire episode, are even aware of the fact that the holodeck is trying to kill two of their senior officers and the senior officer's son. 3 people, their lives are in danger, and the crew is completely oblivious, not even the slightest bit aware of this, even though they realize that Data's experiment is causing all these malfunctions throughout all their systems. They don't even bother to fucking check the holodeck. So this makes them, on top of this having there being an entertainment system trying to kill people, the crew's incompetent because they don't even realize that this entertainment system's trying to kill people. And on top of that, this entertainment system has a history of trying to kill people. And so they should check, maybe this holodeck can be fucking dangerous if the safety malfunction. Let's make sure these systems are still working. Let's do a quick check and see if it's working. Oh, by the way, where is Worf and Counselor Troy? Like, how long are they trapped in this holodeck for? People could argue about the time frame, but it seems to me to be over a day, or at least a day, and no one bothers to, I wonder where fucking Counselor Troy is. That frustrates me so much that the whole crew is fucking incompetent in this episode. And so, boom, that's what tanks the episode, not the fact that it's a Western. That is my point. Yes, I'm not a fan of Westerns, but that's actually not my biggest issue with this episode. This episode could have been good because you can do Westerns that I like. That is possible. What I'm saying is people tend to ignore the fact that this is a typical Trapped in the Holodeck bullshit, that cliche that portrays the crew as incompetent and just gives an excuse for Brent Spiner to do a lot of ham acting. They ignore that because, I like Westerns. And because I don't like Westerns, I don't have that bias towards Westerns. So it's not about my bias against Westerns. It's about other people's bias towards Westerns, because you take that bias away and judge the episode on its own merits. It's a piece of shit trapped in a holodeck cliche bullshit. Now, if they didn't do the trapped in the holodeck and they made it a character story about Worf, then it would be a good character story regardless of whether or not it's a Western. So the people who liked it more than me because not only is it a good character story, but it's a Western, I love Westerns, I think they'd be totally justified in liking this episode. I still maybe wouldn't like it as much as they do because I still wouldn't have that boost that they do, but I would still be like, no, you're right, it is a good episode. But because they threw in this threat of the week that ruined the entire episode, they no longer have a point. They're wrong. It's not a good episode. It's a bad episode. And regardless of whether or not you like Westerns or thought it was fun, it is objectively a terrible episode now. I shouldn't use the word objectively, but I really think it is, because it's just, if you strip it down to its fundamentals of what this episode does, it's another trapped in a holodeck bullshit that portrays the crew as bloody incompetent. And yeah, the whole side plot with Data and, him talking Westerns every once in a while, people are like, oh, that's funny. And that's dumb. Like, why is that? Did the computer latch on to that one particular holodeck program, not anything else was noticing? And why didn't they fucking notice? Why didn't Geordi notice that it was specifically pulling from the holodeck? And then, maybe I should fucking check on the holodeck to see if no one's in there being killed! Sorry. This gets me. It really gets me. Yeah, so other than that, I don't really have anything much to say about, like, the specifics, like, about that Mexican guy who laughed all the time, or the son who was like, oh, yeah, I'm much uglier than that, or whatever. They're just all typical Western stuff, and, and Troy wanting to be the stranger, like... Yeah, I don't really have anything to say about this. So you got to care about Westerns to care about that, I think. So I would now like to thank my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. I would like to give a big special thanks to Brandon Ilhouse. Thank you so much for your support. And also like to give a shout out to Antarius, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hoax, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Miguelicio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very much for your support. So we do have a few Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Antarius, who says, because I am a fan of Westerns, I am certainly much more positive towards this episode than most. Sadly, the enjoyment of the episode is diminished by the classic holodeck malfunction trope, and the Western story itself is not very original or interesting. Alexander's Game Boy is gigantic. There were some good and funny scenes, especially the very first one in Picard's quarters, but it's not enough to really call it a successful comedy episode. My rating is a 6 out of 10. Well, I would actually say most people are more positive than you, because it seems like tons of people love this episode, which... yeah, I'm definitely more negative than you, though, I will say. Anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who said, as I said in a previous comment that this episode is fun, I love the Western theme. However, the multiple datas was way over the top and was a bit ridiculous. He should have been only Frank Hollander. This was Robert Hewitt Wolf's only written credit for TNG, and then he shipped over to DS9 as he destroys Worf's character. When did Worf become a great father, taking his son to the holodeck? This character was not Worf, but his clone Dorf, like they did in Lower Decks episode Reflections. Picard plays the flute from The Inner Light. The scenes with Data on the Enterprise acting like a cowboy was is dumb. So my rating is 7. Remember the Star Trek magazine that did a section called The Fistful of Datas was about facts from the show, as I can't really recall, out of 10. So Worf is not a good father because he didn't want to spend time with his son and was trying to find any excuse not to. I mean, I suppose you say he becomes more of a good father by the end of the episode, but at the start, he remains a terrible father. Robert Hewitt Wolf, yeah, this was the first episode he wrote for Trek. But then he became a prominent writer. He became Ira Steven Behr's writing partner, in fact, on Deep Space Nine. I already told the story about how when Michael Pillard tried to fire him, Ira Steven Behr put his foot down, and Michael Pillard was like, all right, well, if it's that important to you. But I think he left the show in season 5, if I remember correctly. Anyway, now, as far as Picard playing the flute from Inner Light, that is one thing I did forget to mention. That I think, because I talked about my revisit of Inner Light, about how everyone was complaining that there was no follow-up to the Inner Light, but there was. Not just lessons was the big one, but also they show him, but simply by showing him playing it in this episode, you might be like, oh, that's not a huge follow-up, but it doesn't have to be. It's like, it's a subtle, because Picard didn't play any musical. He was not musically inclined at all before the Inner Light. So just simply having him play, I think, was a really nice touch. But that scene at the start where he was trying to play the flute and people kept interrupting him, like, I didn't buy that, because surely the Enterprise has some sort of do not disturb sign. I mean, he's off duty. He should have a do not disturb sign. Now with Crusher, she came in to ask about breakfast, so that's a social call, so that's a bit different. I can accept that. But Geordi and Data going there on official business and Worf going there on official business seems like they should bother Riker with this shit if Picard's off duty. I think there should be a do not disturb button. But anyway, next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, this had potential to be an interesting episode of Worf, Alexander, and Deanna in a holodeck adventure, and maybe see what others are doing on their day off. Instead, it is a holodeck safeties off episode that by now has become typical and a ham fest for Brent Spiner. Yes, he was a hit on the Appalachian Patriarch and Night Court, but this becomes almost unwatchable and hashtag absolute fail for humor. 3 overhammed datas out of 10. Yeah, I only saw his appearance on Night Court like recently, within like the past 10 years for the first time. I did watch Night Court when I was younger, so maybe I saw it and totally forgot about it. But I watched it recently and I thought, yeah, it's just Brent Spiner being goofy. Like, wasn't too impressed by it. But yeah, it is definitely worse than this episode though. Totally unnecessary and plot contrivance. Anyway, next comment is from Brandon Neal Howells, who says, disclaimer, it wasn't until years after I watched this episode that I realized that the title was a ripoff of Sergio Leone movie A Fistful of Dollars starring Clint Eastwood. The proper term, Brandon, is homage, not I'm just. But no, that I recognize. Even though I hadn't seen any of those movies when this episode first came out, I recognized it right away. It's like, oh, they're doing that Clint Eastwood movie, A Fistful of Dollars. But anyway, Alexander says, "Settle up, father," but before entering a holodeck Western program with no horses in it. Why is Picard still giving permission for Geordi to plug data into the ship's computer? Am I the only person who remembers when you can boot up a computer in safe mode? It seems extremely important a few days after CrowdStrike had a global outage. How is this holodeck program Deadwood? There are hardly any people and no one even whispers cocksucker. I never seen that show, so I wouldn't know. All the characters turning into Data gets very boring very quickly. I'm not sure Worf is the right choice for the sheriff. I think Odo would work better. 1 horrible Texan accent out of 10. Wow, 1. Wow, that's even worse than I'm going to give it. But I agree with the sentiments totally about, the whole Data side plot with them plugging him in, that was just nonsense. This is just BS excuse so they could do the trapped in the holodeck BS. But anyway, thank you so much, patrons, for your comments. So my rating for a Fistful of Datas, I almost said a fist. I don't know. I don't know what I almost said, but my rating for Fistful of Datas out of 10 is going to be a 3. Very poor. I considered giving this episode a 4, to be honest. But the more I talk through it, because I like the idea of it is fine, and I like the first part. It's just as soon as we get into that trapped in the holodeck cliche and the safeties are off. I mean, what good are these fucking safeties? They're not really safe if they don't work, if they dysfunction all the time. Like they seem pretty. They should be built into the. I think I complained about this in The Big Goodbye already, but they shouldn't even exist. They should be a function like built into the holodeck. You shouldn't have to call to turn them on or off, and they should never ever be able to malfunction. Like if the safeties should be built in, but if they somehow malfunction, then the whole holodeck should stop working. That should be like, that seems to be a good safety method. Like if that seems like the kind of backups we have now, let alone with 24th century technology. Like if something isn't working properly and is going to be dangerous to you, then there's usually like a mechanism to make sure that thing doesn't turn on at all. And so that should be the case with the holodeck. Like as soon as the safeties malfunction, the whole program should crash as a backup. But their safety functions fucking suck. But as I talked about earlier, that's just they're just doing it for plot contrivance because they want some freaking threat of the week. But it just makes the Enterprise seem like a death trap. So I hate it. Anyway, but I'll go as high as a 3 because some good character stuff, that was okay. So anyway, I think I'm actually being generous giving it a 3 the more I think about it, but I'll stick with my 3. So that is it for my review of A Fistful of Datas. So coming up next on my channel, let's see here. Thursday will be my review for The Quality of Life. Saturday will be my review or revisited for Chain of Command. So over on Patreon, for my Patreon supporters, we'll be revisiting my review for Chain of Command parts 1 and 2. Sunday, I'll be reviewing House of the Dragon season 2 as a whole. And then on Monday, the big day, starting Deep Space Nine, with my review for the premiere episode for Deep Space Nine, Emissary. Now, if you're confused why I'm starting Deep Space Nine when Next Gen hasn't finished, then you probably didn't hear me talk about this before, which I think I have several times, that I am not going Next Gen, then Deep Space Nine, then all Voyager. I'm not doing that. I'm going in order of air date, because I believe that's how they were intended to watch, and I think that gives a different perspective. So Deep Space Nine started airing after Chain of Command aired, so that's when I'm going to review it. And so I'm going to be reviewing these two shows side by side because that's how they aired. So that's going to be interesting. Anyway, so yeah, be sure to check out my channel to keep up with all the Star Trek coverage. And yeah, be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching.